Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're located, on microloan portfolio management. I'm Joyce Klein, and I'm the Director of Field at the Aspen Institute. And we are so pleased to be able to offer this webinar with two experts and former practitioners who've developed some really strong expertise in this area. And I'm going to introduce you to our presenters and turn you over to them in just a few minutes, but I'm going to start with some basic introductory remarks. So the first thing I want to do is just go over some of the technology for the session. We have a large group on the call today. I presume, and it looks to me from what I can see from our technology, that most of you have joined us and are listening through your computer speakers, but some of you who have dialed in on the phone as well. For those of you listening on your speakers, you make sure the speakers are turned up so you can hear us well. For those of you on the phone, we have everyone in listen-only mode to make sure we have good audio quality for the call. We do hope you'll feel free to make comments and ask questions along the way. So we encourage you to do that by chatting those questions and comments into us. If you locate the chat box on the bottom left hand of your screen, that's the way that you can pose questions to us. Just so you know, your messages only come to the presenters, so please don't be shy about volunteering an answer or sharing your questions. We've set aside time throughout the session to share your comments and your questions with our speakers. And a couple other things. Please note you can view the presentation in full screen by clicking on the full screen icon on the top of your screen. But when you look at it in full screen, that chat box goes away. So you need to exit full screen so you can get back to the chat box. You should also just know there are a couple times during the presentation when we actually have polls where we want to hear a bit from you, so you'll see that feature come up a few times. If you have technical issues during the event, you can send us a message via the chat window, or you can email Tony Mastria on our staff. His email address is Tony, Tony, Mastria at aspeninstitute.org. And finally, the PowerPoint is already posted on our website, so that is available to you. And I also want to let you know that we are recording this event so that others who aren't able to join us today can access it. And we'll be sending out a link to that recording shortly. So just briefly, I want to give those of you who don't know us a bit of an introduction to Field at the Aspen Institute. Our mission is to advance business ownership as an economic opportunity strategy. We are actually part of the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute, and the work of EOP, as we call it, is to advance promising strategies to help low and moderate income Americans to connect to and thrive in our changing economy. And Field is the part of the Economic Opportunities Program that focuses on the work that business ownership can play in advancing economic opportunity. And to do that, we do a couple things. We try to build knowledge through applied research and data collection. We work to strengthen leaders through peer learning and leadership development initiatives. And we work to inform donors and others through research and publications. We also do some public events that are aimed at raising awareness. And a good deal of our work has focused on both documenting and sharing leading practices in the microenterprise field, and also on collecting data that can be a tool for both strengthening practice among practitioners working in the field and also demonstrating the value of the work that practitioners do. And our webinar today is actually intended to advance both of those goals. First, we want to share information about leading practice in the area of microloan portfolio management. And second, we're offering the webinar as an inducement for you to respond to our US Microenterprise Census, which is the annual data collection effort that we undertake to collect data on as much of the microenterprise development field as we can. And we use that data to educate funders, policymakers, the media, and others who want to understand the value of the work that we all do and the value that it creates. So in past years, I will note we've spent significant resources as we do the US Microenterprise Census. We try to contact you through email, through phone calls, through other methods to ask microenterprise organizations to report data. And this year we thought we'd take a different approach and we'd invest some of those same resources rather than spending it sort of nagging you. We would offer content as an incentive. We offered a webinar last month on microloan underwriting. and we're offering this one today. I have to admit, thus far our strategy is not working that well. Although we got really good feedback on the content from the last webinar, we have not seen a lot of organizations responding by reporting their data. So we're hoping we do better this time. And at the end of the webinar, I'll come back on and provide information on how to report your data. So just two other quick things. One, just to be clear about the focus of this webinar, we're talking about portfolio management, especially as it relates to microenterprise loans. And in terms of how we define that, by microenterprise loans we mean business loans of $50,000 or less. And we're also talking about loans that are specifically targeted towards the underserved populations that are served by mission-led lenders. So entrepreneurs of color, women, immigrants, individuals with disabilities, and others who have the most difficulty accessing credit from traditional sources such as banks. And so with that, let me introduce our speakers today. I've had the privilege of knowing and working with them for several years. Leslie Hoffman and Barbara Eckblad both have a deep commitment to the mission of microlending, which is to serve underserved borrowers. And while both are consultants, each of them also has experience leading lending teams in micro and small business CDFIs, as well as in their consulting practice now working with other CDFIs. And you can see a bit more about their work here on the slide. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and say again thanks to Leslie and Barbara for taking the time to be with us today, and turn it over to Leslie.
Great. Joyce, thanks so much. And a huge thanks from Barbara and me to the field team for all that you're doing, have done, and continue to do on behalf of Microenterprise. We deeply appreciate you all. And welcome back for those of you who joined us last month to dig into a conversation about underwriting, and welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. We're really excited to take the next step in our conversation about risk. And so today is really about sharing, as we said last time in our conversation, we want to share knowledge and tips that we are really grateful to have received from so many of you all, terrific practitioners, great clients, researchers. So this is definitely an amalgamation of things that we've been taught by great practitioners and people in the field. Last time we started the conversation about risk, if you all will recall, at the individual level, at the individual credit level, as we thought about underwriting approaches in microlending. Well, guys, today is step 2 in that conversation. So we've made now the decision to invite a borrower into our portfolio, and we've made maybe a lot of those invitations to invite folks into our portfolio. Then what? So as we did last time, Barbara and I, we're going to offer you all, as you see up here on this slide, a framework to analyze, we hope, and build and improve your portfolio management practices. We're also going to get into some techniques that we do hope help you all with the day-to-day work of risk management in your portfolio. And we're really excited to talk about this. I think as those of you who have worked with us, seen us present at OFN, these are topics we love to talk about. And so here's what we unfortunately regrettably can't cover. We'd love to actually talk about all of these things you're going to see on the screen because talking about risk is just something Barbara and I love to do. But alas, team, we don't have your whole day. So here's what we're not unfortunately going to be able to dig into deeply today, and we just want to let you know ahead of time in case you thought we were going to have some deep discussions here. Not going to have a lot of time, guys, to talk about loan servicing today, loan closings, for example, even how to create reports, the wonderful world of crystal reporting. God bless all of you who do it. Collections techniques, legal collections, all of those things. These are all components that certainly impact and can help drive portfolio performance, but we're just not going to be able to get into that stuff in any kind of depth today. So if you are looking for help on any of these topics, what Barbara and I want to say is that just let us know. Holler at us afterward. Our emails will be available. You can let the team at Field know. They can reach out to us because we actually have spent time in most of these areas as well. And so we're happy to talk to you or give you some suggestions and resources about next steps. So with that, we're excited to dig in. Barbara, you want to set up this first question for everybody?
Thanks, Leslie. Yes. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to those who joined us last month. It's a delight to have you. And for those who are with us for the first time, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. We hope that what we are sharing with you today is something that will help you in your work starting immediately. So We'd like to start with a question just to check in and explore the perspectives that you're bringing to today's conversation on portfolio management. So we have a poll that we'd like you to take. It should be appearing on your screen now. Yep, there it is. And we'd like to ask you this question. What are the essential components of portfolio quality management from your perspective? Is it a clear definition of risk? Is it documents that give you the risk parameters that might appear in your loan policy manual, for example? Is it the sound method you use for monitoring risk? And or is it the feedback loop that you use for reporting that risk to your organization? So we'd like to have you respond to this right now. And we're just going to pause here while you respond. So it looks like people are responding. We have about 60 plus people who've responded so far. Just give you a couple more, maybe 10 more seconds to think about it. Okay.
Okay, Barbara, should I close the poll?
That would be great. Thanks, Leslie. So here's the results. What are the essential components of portfolio quality management? So 24.6% of you said it's a clear definition of what risk is. 20% said that it's documenting what your risk parameters are. 47.8% said that it's the method you use for monitoring that risk in your portfolio, and 7% talked about using the feedback loop. The answer actually is all of this, a little bit of a trick question. So portfolio quality management, with the weight of the word on portfolio quality management, is really all of these things. It's clear definition of risk for your organization, how you document those risk parameters that define that risk in your loan policy manual, how you monitor that risk in your portfolio, the reports that you pull out, the data you look at, and also the feedback loop you use to be able to report that to the rest of the organization. Okay, so thanks for that. Thanks for responding to that poll. We've teed up this conversation because it's inherently about risk. And now that you've shared what you were thinking about risk in terms of what you bring to the conversation today, we'd like you to think about the elements of portfolio quality management. What are those specific elements? So where do you land on this question of risk? Here's the question. How do you define risk in your organization? When you take a step back and you think about how your organization talks about risk and how you define risk, tell us, please, in this free-flowing answer, type in for us what you think, how you experience, how your organization defines risk.
And guys, what we encourage you to do is you're thinking about, oh, go ahead, Barbara.
Nope, go ahead.
I was just going to say, guys, what we encourage you, again, type right in there. Try not to edit yourself. We're just really curious to see, what are words, phrases, thoughts, concepts that come to your mind. And we're starting to see some folks type in responses. So people are saying things like loss of principal, loan losses, likelihood of repayment, level or delinquency, and charge-offs. So again, this just gives us the opportunity to really get a sense of where you are in this conversation. So, what really are the things that come first and foremost to your mind? We've got some C's, folks who were talking about the C's from last time. Nicely done. We appreciate that continuation of the 5 C's framework from our underwriting conversation. We've got folks who are talking about bad loans, repayment issues. Mainly we're looking at the risk of loan repayment. That's a good and important answer. Thank you for that. So some good responses thus far. We've got about a third of you all who are typing some of these responses. So keep those answers coming. Cash flow. People are talking about current acceptable risk in the portfolio. Great. All right, risk of loan repayments. Some folks are also highlighting loan loss reserves, that they're really monitoring and keeping an eye on loan loss reserves as a measure, as well as credit history and longevity of employment. So we're getting into some measures here, I think, from an underwriting perspective as well. Great responses. Okay. So Barbara, any thoughts or reflections you want to share on some of what we're hearing from people around this definition of risk and where people are focusing their attention? We've got a lot of, it looks like, energy around this notion of repayment, a lot of energy around delinquency management, some references to underwriting standards, and also some references to key ratios like loan loss reserves.
I like also someone wrote in likeliness or likelihood of repayment. So again, addressing risk rating, for example, and how that plays into portfolio quality review. Excellent word, likelihood.
Great. We're also getting some folks who are talking about getting into the financials of the organization around balance sheet management. We really like that answer as well. Reminding ourselves that monitoring risk is a holistic experience, and defining risk, therefore, is a holistic experience. So we want to see and understand what our financials look like and how those are tied to the inherent risk in our portfolio. Great answer. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out for you, Barbara.
Okay.
Great. Barbara, anything
also,
else you'd like to say in terms of what we've heard?
I think another piece that is showing up in the answers that I think is really awesome to see and great answer is this idea of acceptable risk over time and how the historical performance over time is important. And that is something that we'll talk about later on in the webinar. So excellent answer. Thanks, Leslie.
Super. Well, yeah, thank you, Barbara, and thanks everybody for your participation in both of those conversations. I think for Barbara and I, it's helpful to know that we've got a team of people here with us today that are really focused on monitoring from that first answer, and that's terrific. And we also have a good, I think, strong set of answers around how you're looking at monitoring risk. Some of what we're going to offer for you today is also to help you with that fourth answer in that first part, and that is this notion of feedback loops. So more to come on that. But as we get into this conversation, team, here's where we want to start as we get back into a conversation around risk for those who joined last time. As we shared then, Barbara and I work at taking a holistic view of the concept of risk. So we want you to think of what you see visually in front of you right now really as a chessboard. And all of those dark blue boxes that you're seeing, think of those as bishops or rooks on the board of risk. You move or you adjust one, and you really do change the game in chess. And the same thing can work with portfolios, but portfolios behave similarly. So we also know credit risk, that first one, tends to be the proverbial belle of the ball. It gets a lot of attention, and that's good, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. We also encourage you all to keep in mind that when focusing on portfolio management, we have to keep our peripheral vision really alert to other elements of risk in our organization that could impact portfolio risk, or frankly, it could be impacted by portfolio risk. And so, for example, that may be things that are happening in the market. That may be things that are happening operationally within your organization, or it may be what your own balance sheet looks like as an organization. These are all things that we want to keep in mind as we get into this conversation about portfolio management. Now, last month we dug into this top circle that you're going to see when we talked about the belle of the ball that is credit risk. We talked about individual credit risk, and we got into a conversation about underwriting. And our message was that the best practice we've been shown and taught by great practitioners, researchers, and clients is on the microloan underwriting side, it's really about 4 fundamental attributes. Best practice underwriting for microloans is systematic, it's monitored, it's transparent, and it's evidence-based. Today, guys, we're going to actually say the very same model is appropriate at the portfolio level, that a best practice approach to portfolio management passes that very same 4-part test. So how you build that kind of PQ management approach now becomes the question, right? How do we get there? So here's where we're going to go now. We're going to give you a simple framework to use for this work to get to that 4-part test. Now, fair warning, we're not going to have time to dig really deeply into the actual role of portfolio manager, although, again, this is something Barbara and I, not surprisingly, love to talk about. That's a whole other webinar, and maybe we do that at some point. But we're going to give you a couple of recommendations on the staffing side that I think will help that role and those people who are involved in that work. So let's get into the framework. Barbara.
Thanks, Leslie. What we want you to think about in terms of the fundamentals of portfolio management is that it really is understood, it can be understood simply in the concept of a 3-legged stool. So in terms of the 3 basic and essential elements of portfolio management, we want you to think about it in terms of the 3 legs: data, tools, and structure. And when you really think about your portfolio going down to the smallest detail, that's what the data allows you to do. And then you need to build these tools that will help you aggregate that data and study it and see what that data has to say to you really about your portfolio's performance. And finally, I wouldn't say the most important, but really essential not to forget that we need to make sure we build into this is the structure for actually telling people in the organization what you've learned about the data through the reports or the tools that you're using to make transparent. So those are the 3 concepts that we're going to work on today and talk about in order to give you a framework for thinking about how to do portfolio quality management: data, tools, and structure. So let's dig into the first one, to data. When we think about portfolio performance, we think about 3 buckets of data: deployment, delinquency, and default. Many of my clients hear me talk about this, like the 3 Ds. What are the 3 Ds of portfolio quality management? Delinquency, deployment, and default. There they are, 3s. Okay, so when we think about these, we really think about deployment as money going out in terms of number and dollars of loans, and then delinquencies and defaults as to how money is delayed in returning to our portfolio and or money isn't going to return to our portfolio at all. So these are the data points that we would list as really those that are most critical in terms of understanding how that portfolio is performing. Let's take a little bit of a closer look then at deployment. We'd like to recommend that you think about deployment in these buckets in terms of the data that you want to analyze about your deployment, both dollars and numbers of loans that are going out. If you're an organization that offers more than one product, we want you to think about reporting those dollars and loans out not just by your whole portfolio, but by product, because we know that it's important to understand how the different products are performing. We want you to think about making sure that you track those dollars and numbers of loans by closed loans, also by dispersed loans, and then the last category is by the capital that you've committed that is yet to be dispersed. If you're an organization that has multiple funding sources, that capital committed is a really important data point to track, because you want to make sure that you have enough money in each of the funds that you're deploying out of to make the commitments that you have in terms of approved loans ready to close. So understanding deployment and where you are in deployment against your goals is really important. Let's look at delinquencies. In terms of delinquencies, it's really important. I want to elevate for you that many organizations start and end their tracking of delinquencies with individual borrower delinquencies, a delinquency report that tells you who's late on which loans. What I'd like to challenge you to do today is to open that up and to make sure that on top of working on your collections, and that is addressing the individual loans that are past due, the individual borrowers who are past due, that you begin to get a higher and higher level of look at what those delinquencies are doing writ large in your portfolio. The way we're going to do that is we're going to look at the aggregate of all those past dues or portfolio at risk by aging category. So when you pull that delinquency report, it should show you how many are 30 days due, how many are 60 days due, how many are 90, and then how many are 120 plus. So it's important to look at your portfolio as a whole and look at the buckets of dollars in each of those aging categories of 30 plus, 60, 90, and 120. I also want to elevate for you that it's really, really important that we track restructures. So anytime we've made a decision to restructure a loan to help the borrower better meet their cash flow level in terms of making that repayment, we count that as a restructure. It's important to code those in your portfolio software as restructures and then to track the performance of those restructures, not only the level of restructured dollars in your portfolio, but also how they're performing as against the performance of the portfolio as a whole. Are your restructured delinquencies the same as, lower, or higher than that of your portfolio as a whole? We also want to encourage you to track your concentrations of risk. So for example, industry risk or by collateral. If you have a heavy concentration of real estate-backed collateral, you may want to track that concentration of risk. And also if you have risk by geography. If you have different areas where you deploy capital and you want to track different locations where that capital is being deployed, you may want to do that because one geographic location may be struggling more than another. So these are areas where you need to track the delinquencies and the performance of those loans in your portfolio across those what I call subclasses of risk. Okay. Let's move on to defaults. In many ways, the way we track defaults really parallels the way we track delinquencies. We want to track by product. We want to track by concentrations of risk to see really if we have abnormal levels of defaults in the portfolio. It's also important to track both delinquencies and defaults by a specific date. But also I want to encourage you to track on a 12-month rolling trend. And what I mean by that is each month you track the last 12 months and the next month you track the new month and drop off the oldest month so that you have a sense in areas where you are particularly concerned about risk, that you have a sense of whether your portfolio delinquencies and defaults are going up or down. And the same is true for your 3-year historical trend, to look 3 years back and to look year over year, last year at this time, last year and the year before and the year before, how was our historical trend of both delinquencies and defaults? And the last thing I'd like to put on your radar around tracking defaults is how successful you are at tracking recoveries. So once you've charged something off in your portfolio, it's important to track how much of that you are actually getting in recoveries, and that helps you check your strategies for how you follow up with charge-off loans to make sure you get as many of those dollars back in as you possibly can. So we've looked at default, we've looked at delinquency, and we've also looked at deployment. So those are the data that we want to track in terms of understanding how our portfolio is performing. Leslie?
Great, thanks. So let's do a quick check-in, everybody. We've gone through leg number 1 of our 3-legged stool, the data leg, and we just want to make sure that before we move forward that no one has any key questions. And Joyce, anything that you're seeing on your end, any key questions or clarifications that folks need definitionally before we now dig into the next piece of this. Any questions, Joyce, that we need to attend to?
I have not seen any questions come in, so I have been chatting out to people.
All right.
Please do feel free to pose questions if you have them. And Leslie and Barbara, I will flag you if I think we need to. They start pouring in, and we might want to pause again quickly to take a few.
Okay, sounds great. Don't be shy, team. All right, with that, just also now, guys. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry,
Barbara?
Leslie. Someone just popped up a question about the portfolio software and being able to track deployment delinquency and default in portfolio software. Would you like to take a shot at that, or shall I?
Why don't you start, and then I will support you.
Awesome. Here's what I would encourage you to do. In terms of how you use your software to report data points, I'd encourage you to sit down and ask yourselves what questions do we want answers to? And then once you have that, your list of questions you want answered, I would go back to your software and say, okay, what's the reporting capability that gives us these answers? Sometimes there are reports that are available in the portfolio software that you may not be aware of. So if you don't see a report that helps you answer that question, you might check with the software developer to ask that question, and or have them help you learn how to export data so that you can change the data and manipulate it to get the answers that you want. So that's how I would approach the software. Leslie, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd also encourage you all, if it's an actual software purchase that you're contemplating, you're trying to figure out what software program that you ultimately want to buy. Barbara's advice, I think, is spot on. I'd also encourage you to have conversations with colleagues at organizations that are at the size you aspire to be, not at the size you are right now. And this is important because I think that one of the things I certainly learned in my practitioner days, as well as having experience with clients, is that it is really important that from a functionality perspective and from a staff capacity perspective, your software can grow with you and you with it. And so I would really encourage you all to have conversations with practitioners. There are a variety of options out there. And I think it's again, my biggest suggestion is to sit down and talk to some strong practitioners who you respect, who are at a place in their portfolio that you would like to be at some point. I have generally found that folks are very, very generous about sharing those kinds of tips. Okay? Great question. All right, folks, keep chatting those questions in. And we'd like to also now check in again. So on this question of portfolio metrics, Barbara is just taking you through, I think, a really great quick tour through the Ds, 3 Ds of data. We want to know what your organization is tracking consistently, and we already have folks who are typing those answers in, so feel free. Now is a great time. I want to highlight the key word here, team, is consistently. We really want to know, what are you all at the organizational level looking at all the time? What does that look like? What are those data points that you are consistently looking at and tracking? We've got certainly payments. Folks are talking about default and delinquency, cash flow, which is great. So we've got dollars, number of loans committed, number of loans outstanding, delinquencies, write-offs, recoveries. Terrific. We've got aging, default rates, and location. I think that's really important. We've got a lot of folks who are talking about aging, and so I think that's an important piece that goes to Barbara's important highlight, that aging is so important. And again, when we're talking about aging, we're talking about those individual loans and where they fall in that 1 to 180-day spectrum. And we're also going to encourage and challenge us on this call, right, to think at an aggregate level as well. We've got folks who are talking about demographics, which is great, understanding who is receiving their loans. monthly delinquency. We've even got some folks who are chatting in some thoughts around what levels are keeping delinquencies below 4%. We're gonna also talk about that here in a second around goal setting, which is really important. Folks are also offering some, I think, important data points around mission. So jobs created, for example, is another, I think, important data point. Number of minority businesses owned. So some important data points on the outgoing piece of this. How are we doing on accomplishing mission? We've also, and I appreciate who's typed this in, we've got a couple folks who are being really honest with us, and we deeply appreciate that. Somebody has shared that they are not really tracking any metrics right now consistently, none at the moment they're tracking consistently. There's a variety of data points they look at over time, but nothing consistently. So really good, helpful pieces of information that offer us a little bit of insight into what your operational environment looks like. Barbara, before I close the poll, anything else you'd like to add or comment on regarding the responses we're seeing from folks?
Not at this point, but thank you.
Great.
Leslie, this is Joyce. Can I add in the question right now, because I think it relates to this conversation,
Sure.
And maybe to tee it up before we get on to the next topic. So one question that came in is, can you use mitigating factors in your portfolio assessment, i.e. customer classification, new startup versus existing?
So sure, and so I would say it's a both-and answer for us. Really making sure that you are looking at how you are accomplishing mission and what are the various, as that practitioner termed it, mitigating factors that might help support and advance that, I think are important. And at the same time, what I think the message from Barbara, from the two of us, is that we want to ensure that you are, though not solely tracking those items. What we want to say is that there is a set of things that we're going to encourage you to track consistently, regardless of what's happening with a particular program or a particular set of goals for a particular set of mission-related items. There are some things we're going to say would be really important for you to track all the time, and Barbara is taking you through them. Some of those more nuanced pieces can help you understand what may be impacting these larger data points. So I would say it's a both and. Barbara, anything you'd add to that?
Yes. Thanks, Leslie. Here's a couple of things to build on what Leslie has said. Whenever you have multiple products or multiple classes of risk, for example, startups versus existing businesses, it's absolutely okay, and it's important for your organization to think through your tolerance for risk in those different categories or classes of risk. So for example, it may be that you sit down and you think about your tolerance for risk and you say, you know what, we're going to look at startups different than existing businesses. We're going to acknowledge the fact that startups may be riskier than existing businesses in terms of lending to them. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we pay attention to the performance of our startups against our existing businesses. And we're going to set a risk tolerance for delinquency and default for startups that may be a little bit higher, and objectify it. We may accept 7% delinquencies for our startups, but only 5% for existing businesses. So you decide where your risk tolerance is, and then you track against that. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is that when it comes to balancing your portfolio, you can add another dimension to your tolerance for risk by saying, you know what, we're going to be willing to put 30% of our dollars into startups and 70% into existing businesses to balance the risk in our portfolio. And then we're going to track the concentration of risk of startups to make sure that we don't exceed our risk tolerance of 30%. So there are ways to mitigate risk and to manage and balance risk if you start with deciding where your risk tolerance is for different classes of risk, and then making sure that you track those so that you can manage to your risk tolerance. Is that helpful, Leslie?
Terrific. Super helpful. And great question. Thank you so much for the person who asked it. So now let's move on now to the tools conversation. So I think we've spent some good time in this data piece. And now where do you go once you've got the data? We've got a common understanding of the data that we're going to be measuring and monitoring over time. So that helps us in that, remember, 4-part test of being systematic, monitoring what we're doing, and being transparent and evidence-based. But how do we move the ball in the test through the tools? So Barbara and I have seen a lot of tools over our years in the industry, both on the practitioner side as well as the consultant side. So what we'd like to do is first, before we dig into tools, we want to start this conversation in making sure we are essentially framing the work that helps support the data that goes into the tool. And here's what I mean by that. So we'd be remiss if we didn't take a quick step back and let's just remind ourselves about some goal-setting work. And Barbara's answer really spoke to this so well. It needs to happen before we go into selecting those tools. And this also kind of helps to speak to the question that the person asked around even software. What kind of reports are going to help you do what you need to do? So here's an assumption we're going to make, but we want to make sure we're making this assumption. And that is that your community development financial institution is doing some form of what you see here on the slide. And that is essentially you are going through 3 key steps. You're setting strategic goals for the program that basically answer the question, what do you want your lending program to look like and why? So Barbara just gave some really great examples of, are you looking to expand into a new community or a new highly vulnerable community that needs your help and reach more deeply into that community? Well, then that's a perfect goal. That's an excellent strategic goal. Step 2 is then to create some operating level metrics to help you monitor that goal, that helps speak to that question that our colleague asked. And then third, we're going to check in with our board, and we're going to make sure that they know that's what we're doing and that they approve these metrics. So that work needs to happen first. Once you've done that work and gone through that process, guys, there's a variety of ways that you can track all of these metrics and understand your corresponding portfolio performance. So there's a bunch of examples here you see on the dashboard that you see, and there's a lot of these examples. You can do scorecards, dashboards, even Excel spreadsheets. What we want to say here, guys, is that what's important in all of these tools is that you really make sure that they are readily understandable. And Barbara, you've got a 7-second test you like to talk about. Do you want to quickly talk about what that means? Oh, so I'll keep moving for a second, Barbara. I'll check in with you in a minute. So what we mean by that is we really want to make sure that those tools can be quickly understood by the people reading them. And we're going to give you an example of what that means in a minute. We'll have Barbara talk about the 7-second test then. It needs to match your operational environment. So not so complicated that frankly your team can't maintain them, but they can't be so simple that they don't tell you what you need to know. They also need to match your organizational culture. As Peter Drucker famously said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so we want to make sure that, you're not turning people off by the way you're presenting the data. Try and see if it can be presented in a way that people are really going to pay attention to. So what might this actually look like in practice? Well, again, we're going to give you first a 3-part test, and we're going to show you a quick example. Here's what the tools should do however they look. They should give you the ability to track and monitor, as Barbara just talked about, those metrics over time in terms of actual versus goal. So this is the important part of step 1. You want to not just be tracking what it looks like, but you want to track what it looks like against where you thought you would be. Step 2 is that it also needs to provide you a window into where you are against where you have been at other stages of the game. Because then step 3 happens. It draws attention to those gaps that may be occurring between what you thought you do and where you are, or where you are and where you've been. That's what good tools do, is they draw attention to those gaps. So we don't have a whole lot of time, and so I'm going to briefly go through this example. This is actually kind of an example, a rough example of the kind of tool that I use and that colleagues of mine helped create for me from essentially a scorecard or dashboard perspective. A couple things that I want to draw out. We're not going to have time to dig into the detail of this particular tool, but first, I hope what you notice is the 5 columns. There are specific measures that we've identified that should look familiar to you based on what we just talked about. These measures include the number of loans we've closed, the number of loans we actually dispersed so that we can see if there are any gaps between those two figures, the dollars dispersed, how much money is going out the door. What is our active portfolio? As we know, guys, that is really the engine that drives everything. It's the lifeblood of our earned income program revenue, so monitoring our active portfolio against all these metrics is critical. We also have our deployment percentage. A quick note, what we mean here, remember this goes back to something Barbara just talked about. We're talking about capital available to lend. So of the total capital we have to lend, how much of it is out the door right now? And then finally, we've got those delinquency and default pieces of data that Barbara highlighted. One piece that we want to make sure you notice here, team, is that on delinquency, we're defining that as 31 plus, so 31 days forward. The reason is that for micro-lending folks, if you're tracking at 60 or tracking at 90 at an aggregate level, unfortunately, that doesn't give you enough timely information to know what's going on. So we're going to really encourage you to be at an aggregate level within your team, tracking at 31 plus and making sure everybody's clear about that. You'll also know then across the rest of the columns, we've got our goal. What was our goal for the year? Where are we at in column number 3 on year-to-date performance? Column 4 is progress as of, we've got year-to-date and progress performance. Where are we percentage-wise against our goal? So we've got the actual number in column 3, and then we've got where we are relative to the end of the year. So with 83% of the year gone, meaning let's assume we're at the end of October, where are we at? And then finally, how did we do last year? So this gives us the ability to see what some of those gaps look like. You also see we're using a lot of color here. So we're literally using a traffic light. So green means we're doing well. Yellow means we are a little bit on the bubble, if not slightly off goal. And red means we really need to dig in and pay attention to what's going on. The reason that having this kind of data presentation can be helpful for you, team, is it helps you be able to quickly identify some of those critically important concepts that Barbara spoke to in the answer to the question just a bit ago. It allows you to be able to identify, for example, are you doing well on production, but you are perhaps maybe having a hard time on portfolio quality, which is the case in this example. Why might that be important? Well, for a variety of reasons. If we see that we are doing well in production, but we are having some portfolio quality issues, then we may need to dig into, for example, our underwriting. Are there some issues there? Or are we growing at a rate that we're having a hard time keeping up with on the collection side of the fence? This also gives us an opportunity to check in on things like the connectedness of the growth of our active portfolio and how well or not we may be doing on that capital available to lend. So this can help, for example, leaders in the organization identify if they may need to quickly go out and raise some more capital so that you've got those dollars to lend to be able to meet your goals by the end of the year. Remember, team, the chessboard. This is what it means to manage that chessboard of risk across your organization. So I've just taken you through an example of how I as a practitioner would use a tool like this to help me monitor performance for both myself and my team and the goals that we are responsible for. But we know that not just us, those folks who are portfolio managers and portfolio officers, need to pay attention to this data. There are others in the organization who should also pay attention to this data. And so here's an example of what maybe a different look at the data might look like. I want to give a big shout out to Liz over at Detroit Development Fund, who is so sweet to put these visuals together. So I love Excel, but I am not awesome at Excel the way Liz is. And so thank you, Liz, so much for that. This is a good example of what a data presentation might look like for perhaps a loan officer who isn't as close to the quality side in his or her day-to-day, but who really drives what that quality looks like in how he or she performs the origination side of lending. In micro-lending, things can happen and change so quickly given the nature of the work that we do. And that's why it's very important for us on the portfolio management side to always have this really holistic view of the way our chessboard or our portfolio may change or shift over time. This is also a way for us to really invite into the conversation in a data-driven, evidence-based, and transparent way our board, our credit committee, those people who are playing instrumental roles within our organization and who may not have either A, the level of familiarity that we do with the data, with the definitions, or with that interplay between various elements of our portfolio, or B, they may know all of those things but just be really busy people. And most of the time, in our experience, we find that board members probably borrow a little bit from both of those buckets. These are busy people who are very smart, but they may also sometimes need a little bit of help or reminder around the things that are important and how they are connected. So this is an example of how you can take that same set of data I just took you through a moment ago, and the examples I gave you about how I would use it as a practitioner, to be able to display and help highlight for people like our board things that may need to be attended to. Remember, guys, 4-part test that we really want to attend to. We really want to make sure that 4-part test of our portfolio management is thoroughly achieved. And Barbara, let me check in with you for a quick second, again, on that 7-second rule. I loved that example that you gave me before. So if you have a minute, I'd love for you to tell the 7-second rule to the folks on the line.
Thanks, Leslie. So the 7-second rule really is about this. It's really about for people in your organization who don't work with the data every day but care deeply about and need to know about what the so whats of the data are, that whatever tool you use to present to them, that within 7 seconds they need to be able to understand really what you're trying to tell them, what the data is, what the gaps are in that data, whether you're on goal or off goal, and what the gaps are in that data. So if they can look at anything you give them, any tool you give them, each individual specific chart that you give them about a data point, and they can figure it out in 7 seconds, it's a great tool. The other thing I want to add to that is that whenever you're working on these dashboards, think of them as dynamic and not static. So when you give a dashboard to your board of directors or to your management team or to the lending team and for review, ask them for feedback on whether the dashboard's working for them, whether the visuals that you've created are really helping them to understand it in that 7-second window. Thanks, Leslie.
Sure. So, team, we've gone through now the first 2 legs of our stool of portfolio management. We've talked about data and the 3 Ds of data and how important they are, and we've talked about the tools and giving you some examples of what those tools might look like. So now, Barbara, take us home on leg number 3.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. So again, we've talked about the data points. We've talked about what good tools are that help us understand those data points. So now let's talk about structure. What's the structure we're going to use to report that data out using those good tools to the people in our organization who need to analyze, interpret, and act on that data? So The next chart that we have, the next slide for you, is what I call a functional org chart. And what I mean by this is that this is an org chart about all the functions that need to happen in a holistic lending organization, not by person or staff position, but really just about function. So you may be someone who works in an organization that has 5 people, or you may work in an organization that has 30 people. Regardless of the size, it's important that each of these functions is well-heeled and being done within your organization. And as you know, if you come from a small organization, many times one person might have multiple functions from this org chart on their desk. What I really wanted to point out to you too and highlight for you is this, the portfolio management function. When we talk about portfolio management writ large, what we're talking about is loan closings, loan servicing, collections, portfolio monitoring, and compliance. When Leslie talked to you about the things that we couldn't cover today, she mentioned that we couldn't cover loan closings and servicing, collections, compliance. What we're really focusing on here is your portfolio management function. And I wanted to highlight that in the context of a full org chart in terms of the functions of a lending team. So let's go now to look at specifically at what I call portfolio quality review. This is really about being able to, the discipline and the function of looking at that data through those reports, through those tools, and understanding what's happening in your portfolio. What's the structure and process you're going to use then to help that information roll to the people who need to look at it? There's really 3 parts to this. There's a team review of the work, there's a management review of the work, and there's a board review of the work and the results. So what we recommend to you is that on a monthly basis, your lending team sits down and in the process of a meeting spend some extra time looking at the data through the tools that you've developed to know where you are, your goals for where you want to be versus where you are, and have a conversation about any adjustments you need to make in the work you do to make sure that you drive to the goals that you've set for yourself. Then the leader of your lending team is going to take that information and roll it up to the management meeting, the monthly management review of exactly what's happening with your portfolio, where you are in your goals, and if you're off on goals for any parts of it, what the lending team's recommendations to management is about how you're going to change the work that you're doing to make sure you get to the goals. Management's going to respond to that. They're going to look at the data. They're going to look at what your strategies are for change. They may change those. They may go with the recommendations. However that happens, they're going to make a decision about how to report up to the board those board-approved metrics, where you are against those metrics, and what the strategies are for making sure that you end where you want to end in terms of your goals being met. So those are the 3 levels of review that you want to have in your portfolio quality review process. What I'd like you to think about is what we call a functional feedback loop. And that's really this process and how this process plays out in terms of how you live in your organization. This chart shows you what a functional feedback loop is. And do you remember when Leslie talked to you specifically about this idea of moving from the organization's strategic goals, that answer to the question, we will know we met our mission when we have accomplished these things, those strategic goals for your organization and for your lending. Those then roll down to your annual board-approved metrics. So the strategic goal goes down to board-approved metrics for what it looks like to have met those in objective terms. And your senior management team then takes those board-approved metrics and creates an operational plan for the year for how the organization is going to live in its work to drive to those goals. That organizational operational plan gets implemented at the staff level to do the work, and then the work gets reported out as the operational result. The work what we're talking about today is how that gets reported out in terms of your portfolio performance, how you are meeting your board-approved metrics around your portfolio's performance. So those operational results get reported out. They roll up to the senior management team with recommendations for how to make sure that you hit those goals. And the management team takes those to the board of directors in a dashboard report of how you're doing and any adjustments that you're going to make. This whole process is called a functional feedback loop. And as you think about your portfolio quality review process, I'd like you to think about how you, if you haven't yet, how you would integrate the portfolio performance and the quality of it, how it's working through that functional feedback loop up to the board of directors ultimately, so that everyone in the organization knows where you are and what you're doing to make sure that you end up the year where you wanted to be. Leslie?
Great. All right. So, team, we have now taken you through the 3 legs of the framework stool that we believe gives you guys a good sense of the fundamentals around portfolio management. So we've got some time right now before we wrap up and before Joyce takes us through some really important final content, to check in and see what questions people have. Joyce?
So we have a question. When looking at your portfolio year over year, is it sufficient to view 3 years of data, or is 5 years best practice?
Leslie, let me take a crack at that if I can. I think the question is, what is important to your organization in terms of knowing how you're doing? So I would say a minimum of 3 years is really critical. A minimum of 3 years. If you're familiar with ARIS, the ARIS analyst, if you're looking at an ARIS rating, they look at a 5-year historic performance. So if you want to go back 5 years, it certainly is compelling. The important thing when you look back as far as 5 years is to remember where you were 5 years ago and any significant changes that would have impacted the trajectory of any of those trends.
Great. And what I would add to that, let me just add.
No, go ahead, Leslie. I have another question, but you finish. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I think to Barbara's important point that the example she took us through to answer the colleague's question earlier is, I think we want to also encourage you all when you're making, mission-related program changes to your lending, that's when, really actually potentially even looking at total historic performance, if that is possible and feasible for your organization, as you make substantial program changes, and by substantial we're referring to things like the launch of new products, the launch of new geographies, these kinds of what can be sea change moments within your portfolio's performance, it can be really helpful to look at over time what's happened within your portfolio. The other value, I think, of total historical analysis of portfolio is in those moments of economic either adjustment or for all of those of us who lived through 2008, economic meltdown. And as a portfolio manager, someone who had portfolio management responsibility headed into and then immediately following the crisis, what became helpful for me to look at total historic performance is it gave me some helpful insight into how during previous economic downturn cycles our portfolio both performed headed in and portfolio performed headed out of those kinds of major market changes. So just wanted to say that. Joyce?
Great. So there's another question. Do you think or don't you think the split in the role of loan origination and follow-up, as it was illustrated in the structure that you showed, Barbara, creates a problem in terms of performance?
Can you ask that question again? I'm not quite sure I got it.
I can try, but I'm just reading in one. I think it's going back to, I'm going to go take us back to the structure question. And I think what it looks like is, if it looks like on the chart here, you've got sort of origination here, right? And then you've got loan monitoring here, and it looks like those are somewhat sort of different parts of the structure, and does having them in different parts of the structure create an issue?
It doesn't, and here's why. The origination section of the lending program is really about deploying the capital, getting the loans out the door. So you have your business development strategies to build your pipeline. You have your loan officer, pre-loan technical assistance, helping getting the client credit ready, moving them to underwriting, and ultimately to approval. What the portfolio management function does is report that activity. So once most portfolio software can report leads all the way through to close loans, and what you want your portfolio management reports to help the origination team understand is where they are in their deployment levels. So they have the responsibility for reporting out to the origination folks how successful they've been. I hope that answers that.
Great. And presumably also, if you start to see some issues not only with deployment but also with delinquencies, that may be an issue that also comes back to the lending team as well, to talk about what might be happening from an underwriting perspective or a client mix perspective.
Absolutely.
So you might say, okay, yeah.
So whenever we're talking about go ahead, Leslie.
Go for it, Barbara. Go for it.
Whenever we're talking about delinquencies and defaults and the trend being a negative trend, it's really important for us to address that not only in how we are underwriting our different products and our different classes of risk, but also how we're deploying our post-closing technical assistance. Because both of those are risk mitigation strategies that are really important and really important to look at when we're looking at trends in delinquencies and defaults going the wrong way. Leslie?
I was just going to add, for our very, very small micro lenders out there who may have, say, I would love to get to a place where my org chart looks like this. One of the things that I think we want to highlight, and Joyce, I think this is a great example of the field research that's been done, is that what we want to say to those of you who are smaller microlenders and moving your way up that scale ladder is that what the Field Scale Academy research showed is that what we do see over time is greater specialization as loan portfolios get bigger, that there is, because of the necessity around risk management and roles and responsibilities, I think a pretty natural pull toward greater specialization in some of these roles, where you may, as a smaller micro lender, have both origination, all three of those elements that we see under the lending program really housed within the same team, or frankly even same person. One of the seeds that we want to plant for you is that over time, I think Barbara has laid out a potential set of next steps as you think about even kind of the hats that those same people wear. That's all I wanted to add.
Great, thanks. And presumably there's a lot of, part of what you're laying out here, Barbara and Leslie, are the tools for making sure they are, as those functions get split among more and more people because that specialization happens as you grow, what are the ways that information is being communicated to all those various different folks so they can understand what's happening in terms of portfolio performance and portfolio quality so that they can respond to that?
Absolutely. And just to reiterate or to add on to what Leslie was saying, oftentimes when you have a small lending team and you're looking at growing, one of the many questions that I get asked, and I know Leslie does as well, is where do we add a position? And so hopefully this is a tool that you can use to look at where functions go naturally together and don't go together, so that as you want to add a position, you can brush up against this and see what this tells you about where and how to add a position, as well as how you rejigger those responsibilities that people have, so that as you begin to specialize, you begin to differentiate what the responsibilities are on a loan officer's desk, different from the responsibilities on a portfolio manager's desk. Oftentimes that issue of collections, for example, is an issue where you really have to be careful about what you're asking loan officers to do around collections as you grow your team, and what you're not asking them to do, so that they can do what they really want to do, which is to go make new loans. So yes, it's about like how you would grow your organization, as well as now how you share information within the organization about how successful you are. Thanks, Joyce.
Great.
You're welcome,
So
Leslie. I think we need to wrap up. So.
Yeah. Yep. So, what Barbara and I want to leave you all is with this notion. You guys remember, what gets measured gets managed. So the more energy you have around this topic of portfolio management, we believe the more successful you're going to be in accomplishing your goals around portfolio management. So that energy around this work, we think, is absolutely the lifeblood of CDFI's accomplishing and fulfilling their mission. So thank you. And Joyce, thank you so much for the opportunity today.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks to both of you, Leslie and Barbara, for that content. And the one thing I want to just reinforce a little bit, which Barbara started to talk about, is, I think in the field we see a lot of concern, and certainly we at the Aspen Institute have put a lot of focus on how do we scale microlending, because we see there's a great need out there by underserved entrepreneurs. And often there's a lot of focus on what happens at the front end of the lending process, what happens on that origination team, how do we do better marketing, how do we do more underwriting. And the thing that I think is so important, and that as someone who's been in the field a long time has really seen happen, that emphasis on portfolio management needs to happen at the same time, because ultimately, if you're in the finance business, it is all about how you take on and manage risk, and organizations can really sort of get themselves in trouble if they sort of open up the origination window and haven't got all the tools and systems and processes in place to really manage that risk that they're taking on. So as you grow, you're obviously just taking on more risk, and you need to just make sure you know how to manage that. So we hope that you found this conversation to be really valuable and thought-provoking. And if you did, as I mentioned when we started, we'd like to ask you to do something in return, and that is to contribute data to this year's US Microenterprise Census, which is now underway. And many of you may be aware that, obviously, as I said, we collect data each year as part of our census. What you may not know is this is the only source of data out there, certainly the only annual source, on the microenterprise field, on the work of organizations that are specifically targeting the most disadvantaged and challenged entrepreneurs. And this slide gives you a sense of the kind of data that we're able to share because of the US Microenterprise Census. So we're able to talk not only about how much lending activity, but on who our organizations are serving in terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of income status. We're able to talk about all of those things because we collect this data. The way that we collect the data is through an online survey, and it's housed on our microtracker.org website. For those of you who may have participated in the past, especially if you haven't done it in the last couple of years, we really streamlined our survey and made it more user-friendly. We rebuilt our microtracker site last year and did a lot of things to try to streamline the process, to eliminate data points that people clearly found hard to respond to, so to really get to an even more core set of metrics, to give some help along the way. So this just gives you a picture of what that survey looks like. And if you have responded in the past, some of the information that we would normally ask you actually will repopulate automatically, like what kind of organization you are and where you're located. You can update that if it's changed, but that will pre-populate it. And some questions disappear if it turns out there are certain kinds of work you don't do, and so those questions aren't relevant to you. So we would ask that you just, again, please go to our microtracker.org website, to this link, microtracker.org/census, and fill in the census data. We are happy to provide support to you if you get into that process and need any help. So I'm going to leave you with a few things in terms of next steps. One thing which is not on this slide is that, again, we will make the slides available and make the recording available. We will send out a follow-up email, if not today, then tomorrow, that will have links to the slides and links to the webinar. If you also go to the aspeninstitute.org website, there is an event page for this webinar, and all that information will be located there. So that's one piece. As Barbara and Leslie had invited, if you have additional questions, and I know some folks have asked some additional questions, for example, around tracking systems and that kind of thing, you can reach out to Barbara and Leslie individually. Thanks to both of you for making that available. And if you have questions about the US Microenterprise Census, you can contact Lavanya Mohan on our team, who manages MicroTracker for us, and here's her email address as well. So with that, I just want to again thank all of you for joining us today. We hope you find it useful, and invite any feedback you want to share, and please send us your data. Thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.